Hi, everybody. Welcome back to the CCA living room and to our Lost Classics Roundtable. I'm really thrilled to reconvene our esteemed Lost Classics Council, Paul Barnes, who is editor and producer of many of the great Ken Burns films, Joan Tewksbury, who is the best known for her screenplay for Nashville, but has written and directed all kinds of wonderful things, and is also a mentor and an actress and a dancer. And Mara Fortes, the world's greatest film curator in the top 10, our favorite curator. And we've had so much fun. This is our fourth program, and it's interesting to see how the films are starting to bounce up and against each other and against other programs from the Living Room series. Umberto D is a film that's really near and dear to my heart. I saw it in a film class that I was not attending, but my girlfriend was enrolled, so I went and watched it, and it was the first time that I had heard a lecture on a foreign film. And there's a scene in the film where Umberto D peeks through a keyhole, and the way that the professor talked about perspective in that moment changed the way that I understood cinema. It was really radicalizing for me. And as I watched it again, I thought of, how rare it is and why it should not be rare that we see a story of a simple person struggling on the movie screen. And this radical notion of showing real lives. It's a story of eviction. It's a story of a man being neglected in his old age. These are very human stories that we encounter or should encounter every day in real life, and yet we see them so rarely on the big screen. And in a time like now, when we're really called to be more empathetic and more compassionate, more connected, I think this film is really valuable. So I'm really eager to hear Paul and Mara and Joan talk about it. If you like what we're doing at CCA with the living room, please consider donating. You can click through to our website. I'll put the link up, and make a gift before the end of the year. And please support all of those who are doing great work in our community to keep us together during this really difficult time. So I'm going to turn it over to the esteemed council. You guys, I'm so happy to hear you. I'm going to click off and listen and learn. Thanks for being here.
Alrighty.
Thank you. Well, I guess I'll start, since I picked the film for this session. And I have to say, when I was thinking of which film would be good to show, I was feeling also slightly misanthropic with the pandemic situation. And in my mind, I wanted to have a film that didn't have a human protagonist. And in my, my recollection of the film was that it was almost, a story told from the point of view of a dog. And of course it's not, but I think that it's important that you have this dog be the witness to human life, and that you have a non-human witness be the kind of motor of the story. And it's also nice to have the continuity with A Man Escaped. Just there's some aesthetic continuity, but also this idea of having non-actors. And I guess I should start maybe with, since this film is considered kind of exemplary of, or associated with the neorealism in Italy, maybe just talk a little bit about what neorealism is or was, which is, it is one of the most disputed terms, I think, in film history. Is it a genre? Is it a style? Is it a movement? What is it? And I think the first thing that's really striking to me is that, it's a relatively brief historical bracket. It's a brief moment in Italian cinema, and yet it has had enormous global impact. And you constantly hear even Chloe Zhao's films, or Kelly Reichardt, Ramin Barani in the US are described as neorealist. You have Alfonso Cuarón in Mexico, you have Iranian films. So, it's incredible sort of just to track the impact it has had. But I think, it's definitely associated with a visual and narrative styles. So maybe, some of the things it's associated with is that films are shot in real locations, using available lighting, so it doesn't have this studio quality. You also have this freer camera that some people associate with documentary style. This sort of idea that the camera is at the mercy of the action and not action necessarily pre-choreographed for the camera. The use of non-actors, and sort of as an echo of last session of Bresson, this idea that you have sort of the necessary images, that you don't have this sort of self-conscious, obtrusive visual style. And then I think what's also in my mind more impactful are the themes and the narrative style. So usually films about every man, depicting a social reality and following stories that are not a perfect Aristotelian arc, but that are actually full of ellipses and kind of slice of life narrative style. And let's see what else. This, to me, it's kind of the antithesis of what a Hitchcock film would be, where in a Hitchcock film, you don't have anything that is not functioning in the narrative economy. Whereas here, these films are full of these details that you're not really sure if they're relevant, and that actually imitate, I think, the way that we experience everyday life. Mm-hmm. And there's also a kind of humanist perspective, and the stories, the films associated with neorealism are also kind of focused on characters and their individual struggles as something that can be that can have a universal echo. And we talked about this previously, but I think in this film, one of the striking qualities is that you have these very pathos-filled moments, and also this almost comic moment. So you have these shifts in tone, and I think that's part of this idea of replicating the experience of life in film, is to take you through these shifts in tones, because our days are kind of full of those uneven moments. And in terms of I think that the sort of experience of watching these films, there's also this sense that the events of the story kind of have this similar weights. There's not, you can't really tell if this is the climax necessarily, but that what all the visual elements and also the moments kind of have a certain equivalence. And in the historical bracket that I was talking about, it's usually placed more or less between 1942, 1952. So Umberto D would be the tail end of this moment, and it's of course after the war, and there's sort of an ideological reason for the emergence of neorealism, and it's that you have a completely different reality, and you need to find new ways of expressing this reality. And that reality also had material basis, namely that Cinecittà, the big sort of studios, were destroyed during the war, and then actually repurposed as a refugee camp during these years. So there was the very sort of material circumstance of not having studios or access to a lot of equipment that kind of forced filmmakers to find other ways and go out into the streets. But there was also, a reaction to the films of the previous decade that tended to be either these historical epics that were kind of thinly veiled propaganda for Mussolini, just sort of glorifying military commanders, or these very light kind of screwball comedies that the the critics and the filmmakers termed the white telephone films, I guess because it was very common decor item to have these like Art Deco phones. And so, it was also a reaction to that style of filmmaking. And very much inspired by actually French cinema, Jean Renoir, to some extent by Eisenstein and even King Vidor in the US. So these filmmakers, the sort of figureheads of Italian neorealism are Luchino Visconti, Vittorio De Sica, Roberto Rossellini, and Cesare Sabatini, who's the screenwriter of Bicycle Thieves and Umberto D. He was, I think, more of the theorist of the bunch for the movement, but they were well established, and they were inspired by this, by Jean Renoir and these other filmmakers. And even though I think amongst them their styles diverge, but I think what drew them was this attitude of trying to find sort of new ways of depicting the post-war reality. And there are a couple of complicated figures in this historical chapter. One is Vittorio Mussolini, who was Mussolini's, I think, his second son. And he was the editor of a film journal called Cinema, which is sort of what became the forum for all these, for these filmmakers wanting to create a new style. At the same time, Vittorio Mussolini was also a producer and was also kind of an arm of the fascist regime in the sense of, trying to control that the cinema produced depicted a patriotic and good image of Italy. So it's kind of a paradoxical figure, and I don't know, I haven't done too much research on it, but I think it's maybe plays into the ambivalence towards these filmmakers, who are also criticized for not overtly condemning the Mussolini regime, and clearly they were established and had government connections enough to not suffer censorship. And the other figure is Giulio Andreotti, who became a prime minister later on, but he was the Ministry of Education, and he kind of created a form of censorship, pre-production censorship, by vetting screenplays and making sure that they didn't show a bad image of Italy. He also, I think, limited the amount of American films in screens in Italy. So on the one hand, it was a smart way of protecting the Italian film industry, but at the same time, he hated Umberto D and publicly condemned the film for being unpatriotic, and I think that kind of put an end to, that closed the bracket of the Italian neorealism, and also the fact that the films were not commercially successful. So even though there was the spirit of we want to put real Italian people on the screen, real Italian people didn't necessarily want to see their misery on screen. So, there's also sort of theories that that's also what put an end to the movement, and I think it's more of a thing that gets defined in retrospect and debated. And that's interesting too, that, just I think in 1953, there was a Congress trying to define what neorealism was. So just like a year after the films, there was this big Congress, and there were, was it a political attitude? Was it a worldview? Was it just a way of innovating film form? I think it's interesting that the same questions in 1953 are questions that are still going on in film scholarship and in thinking about neorealism. But anyway, that was a very brief and condensed description of neorealism.
Excellent, thank you, Mara. I know it is a fascinating period in film history, and it is very unique to Italy, which is also interesting in many ways, but it's so unbelievably influential. I mean, as you said, it's like, you know, it's influencing modern filmmakers today, like Chloe Zhao or Ken Loach, and, you know, I mean, so many filmmakers who still adopt many of the stylistic aspects of neorealism into their movies, and usually with the same humanist intent. That always seems to be the backbone of these films, to celebrate the struggles of ordinary people in whatever difficulties that they happen to be facing. So it certainly was, you know, it still is enormously influential, for sure. I'd like to do, Jessica has a fascinating career. And I'd like to give you folks a little bit of a quick biography of Jessica, because he's just, it's a really remarkable career with so many different aspects to it. But first of all, I'd like to start out with a quote I found from the great French film critic André Bazin, who said, "To explain Jessica, we must go back to the source of his art, namely his tenderness, his love. The quality shared in common by his neorealist films, Shoe Shine, Bicycle Thieves, Miracle in Milan, and Umberto D, is the author's inexhaustible affection for his characters." And I think that is the common hallmark of not just his neorealist films, but even his best later films. That heartfelt regard for people that De Sica brought to all of his films, to both their you know, their good qualities, but also their foibles. You know, he very much recognizes, you know, the mixed qualities that are contained within single human beings, and tries to bring that forward in all of his characterizations, in all of his work. But just to give you a kind of a broad sense of the scope of his career, he worked in show business in one way or another, and mostly in film, for over 55 years. He directed 35 films and acted in more than 150. Even when he finally became a film director, he still continued to act in other people's productions. He himself was born in 1902 in a small town called Sora, which was near Rome. And then his family moved to Naples, where he spent most of his young life. His father, Umberto De Sica, hence Umberto D. If you notice the dedication at the head of the film, it's dedicated to his father. His father's was named Umberto. He had a brief career as a journalist where he wasn't very successful before becoming a bank clerk for the remainder of his life. So he very much lived the kind of bureaucratic life that the character Umberto D lives, who is described as working for 30 years for the Public Works Department. I think his father was very much of the lower middle class bureaucracy, and that's what basically De Sica grew up with. But his father was also interested in show business and had a lot of show business friends. And because he knew his son had a kind of interest in the arts, he kept introducing him to his show business friends to help get his son's career going. And in fact, when he was just 16 years old, De Sica made his debut on screen in the 1917 silent film. He was also a very popular Neapolitan singer, who was much in demand for amateur entertainments in his younger teenage and early 20s years. For a while, he did study accounting, which he didn't want to do, completed his military service. And when he got out of that, both things he really hated, he finally joined up with a traveling theater company, and his career as an actor began. He progressed from playing clowns and old men, and finally, as he was getting more and more handsome in his early 20s, he graduated to leading roles in romantic comedies. And by 1930, he was a very popular matinee idol. It started out on stage, and then eventually the movies called. And in the 30s, there was this really, thriving commercial cinema in Italy that was a lot of light entertainment and a lot of romantic comedies. And De Sica was much in demand for those films. So he did a whole string of them through the 1930s. One of his most famous was called What Rascals Men Are, which I'm sure De Sica had a blast doing. But many Italian moviegoers and Italian film critics really compared him favorably to Cary Grant. They called him the Italian Cary Grant, both because of how handsome he was and because of his great abilities with light comedy. So in that regard, his background is odd. I mean, thinking about the neorealist, masterpieces he would go on to create. He was so much about commercial cinema, so much about comedy. In the later part of the 1930s, he graduated to becoming a film director himself. And again, was learning his trade by making more and more of these commercial comedies and melodramas that were very popular in Italy at the time. In World War II began, De Sica was so well known as both a film star and a director that he attracted the attention of the propaganda divisions of both the Italian Fascist Party and the Nazi Party. And he was being cajoled into doing some propaganda films for both the Italian fascists and for the Nazis. The Nazis were pretty forceful about wanting De Sica to come and work with them. And, De Sica was not at all interested. That was not his politics by any means, but being the kind of sly dog that he was already contracted to make an Italian film called The Gate of Heaven, which was partially financed by the Catholic Church. And it was about the characters all had illnesses or disabilities of one sort or another that wind up being cured by miracles. And so it was essentially a Catholic propaganda film, I guess. But what De Sica did is he told the people who were trying to get him to make these fascist propaganda films, he said, well, I have to do this film first. And then De Sica and his crew dragged out the production for over 2 years. Ridiculous amount of time to make a film in the 30s and 40s, just so that he wouldn't have to go and do this. And it worked, because by the time he finished The Gate of Heaven, the war was over. And so he escaped the horrible possibility of ever having to work for them. But the war in Italy took a devastating toll on his country. And De Sica and all of his filmmaking compatriots, had to live through that. And then had to face the shame of Italian fascism and the collaboration with the Nazis, the economic and cultural devastation that was left in his country, that left it in major poverty and in ruins. And in many ways, the neorealist film movement grew out of this post-war effort to kind of reconstruct Italy, both as a viable film industry and also spiritually. De Sica in an interview made a very interesting statement about neorealism. He said, the urge to tell the truth stirred in all of us fellow filmmakers. Without knowing it, we were thinking of neorealism, or rather we were creating neorealism. Rossellini on one hand, Zavattini and myself on the other. Many say neorealism arose from our need to make money, to spend less, but that's not true. It really was the need to tell the truth, to have the courage to tell the truth and to take the camera, not into the old studios at Cinecittà, made of paper mache, but out into life, into reality. In De Sica's first collaboration with Cesare Zavattini, the screenwriter who became one of the major figures of neorealism, was a film in 1944 called The Children Are Watching Us. And it was almost like an experiment in neorealism, that film. It was kind of an odd mix of old studio techniques mixed in with neorealism. But what followed that film were 4 masterpieces in a row. Shoeshine in 1946, Bicycle Thieves in 48, Miracle in Milan in 1951, and Umberto D in 1952. Both Shoeshine and Bicycle Thieves won Oscars for the Best Foreign Film, and all 4 films were international hits, cementing De Sica and Zavattini's reputations as world-class filmmakers. But as Mara pointed out, the films were much less successful in Italy than they were internationally. And De Sica was heavily criticized by Andreotti, for example, for airing out Italy's dirty laundry, as one critic expressed it. And the films themselves were not that popular in Italy because it really was showing all of the hardships that the people of Italy were facing. And their pride was somewhat wounded when they did become international hits. So there's an odd paradox that in his own country, his films weren't quite as appreciated as they were on the international scale. And that kind of reaction, I think, to me, Umberto D is a kind of a transitional film. It doesn't have the strong neorealist style as Shoeshine or Bicycle Thieves. It's a kind of a mixture of that with a little more of the studio techniques that he had learned in the 1930s on his more lightweight films. And so it's an interesting hybrid in a certain way. But the thematic concerns of the film, I think, very much are in the realm of neorealism for sure. But after Umberto, De Sica retreated back in a more commercial brand of filmmaking. Many of the films often starred his favorite actress, Sophia Loren. His first film with her was in 1954, The Gold of Naples. In 1960, he did Two Women with Loren, which she went on to win the Best Actress Oscar for that film, becoming the first foreign actress ever to win the Oscar. Following that was 1963's Yesterday, Today, and Tomorrow, which won De Sica his 3rd Oscar for Best Foreign Film, and then 1964's Marriage Italian Style. He was an amazing success internationally with all of these films that he was doing in that period of time. He also continued to act throughout his later career. He was still incredibly charismatic, still very talented on screen, and unbelievably handsome even into his older years. In 1953, he starred opposite Danielle Darrieux in Max Ophuls' great The Earrings of Madame D, which is a terrific film that you should all see. A role in 1957's A Farewell to Arms netted him a Best Supporting Actor nomination. And in 1959, he gave perhaps his finest performance in his friend Roberto Rossellini's General della Rovere. If you've ever seen that film, it's one of the great performances on film that was given by De Sica. His later film directing career was kind of a string of hits and misses. But his biggest success in his late career was The Garden of the Finzi Continis, which was an extremely successful adaptation of Giorgio Bassani's classic novel about the destruction of the Jews in the city of Ferrara during the Holocaust. With that film, De Sica won his 4th Oscar for Best Foreign Film. It's really a wonderful, wonderful film, and I'd urge you all to take a look at it if you haven't seen it before. Following that, he had a one final collaboration with Cesare Zavattini in 1973's A Brief Vacation, which was kind of a return to neorealism for both of them. And it was a very simple tale about a hospital volunteer worker. His final film was 1974's The Voyage, an adaptation of Luigi Pirandello's story that starred Richard Burton and again his favorite Sophia Loren. Later that year in 1974, De Sica passed away. So it's just the breadth of this career is quite extraordinary in terms of the mix of experiences he had both as an actor and as a director, through a whole series of wonderful styles of filmmaking. And, he's left us a really memorable body of work for sure. So that's Mr. De Sica. I think you can see from some of the stills that we were playing that how quite striking he really was. He was a really very charismatic person on screen. So I was just wondering, do we want to, shall we do the first clip that Joan has suggested, maybe just to kind of remind us a little bit about how Umberto D gets off the ground?
Sure, yeah, the opening sequence.
Yeah.
And also I just wanted to remind people that they can send in comments or questions through either, I think, the chat or the Q&A tabs. So
yeah, please.
Just encourage people to join.
Non avete permesso, dovete sciogliervi!
Someone's dog.
It's Flake.
The reason I chose this in the simplicity of the frame and filling it with this amount of activity and action going on, so that there is no explanation except you keep being drawn into it, because he leaves the frame still so that you can observe what's happening in the culture and in the drawing of the people coming toward us. And then I love that you see Umberto for a moment, but you could almost miss him. He is part of the crowd. There's nothing outstanding in this. There's no movie star or big event that happens except the big event. And this is a very long time since I'd seen the film for the first time, but I remember looking through the credits to see what was going on in back of them. So eventually, as the credits faded, I was involved in the crowd. I was going through the crowd as well. And also, I was struck this time by the resonance of what is happening in this country now, or what has happened certainly in the last year, with the kind of the politics that's involved, the dark, the light, the how people have had to suffer loss in a particular kind of way. So it established the fact, a reminiscent for me, that things don't change, that we are often recycling history over and over again. But it's just the use of a static frame, and to pack that much information into it is truly extraordinary, I think.
Right. To me too, it is like he starts Umberto D with one of the hallmarks, I think, of neorealism, which is a kind of a kinship with documentary. The way in which the film is shot and staged, and all of the character, the real people he chose in the crowd, it feels like you're watching a real demonstration. You know, it has that immediacy to it, and as Joan said, Umberto is never you know, featured. You know, he's just in a couple of close-ups. You have to pick him out. It's not really until the demonstration is over that he is separated from the crowd and you begin to follow him. So it's more about the group and about what's happening to the society as a whole, and especially to this group of pensioners, these older folks who are really struggling in this post-war period of time in Italy to get by, and still with all of these, you know, restrictions that are on them and deprivations that are upon them. So it's very much in the vein of neorealism to start this particular film that way.
But I love that it just lands you in it.
Right.
No, you have no escape. You're in it. And so therefore your attachment to this single character as the film progresses, the economy of being able to do that is pretty extraordinary.
Yes, it really is. Yeah.
I just wanted to bring in just a comment from one of the audience members, Marina La Palma, because she brings up the echoes with today. She says, this is so timely. This week in the USA, we have people being evicted during a pandemic as the outgoing administration speeds up executions. And meanwhile, wages have been stagnant for 40 years.
Yeah.
So she's interested in, you know, in the parallels between the film and now. And I think to me also, what I noticed in this opening shot, you know, that it starts with the bells. Mm-hmm. And this is kind of a half-formed thought, but there's this kind of motif of time in the whole film, right? Like the different ways we experience time, or that time is, you know, the sort of the bell as, you know, one type of time, the pregnant maid as another type of time, you know, the idea that Umberto wants to sell his watch, like he's selling time to get money to buy himself more time in the apartment. So I don't know, it was an interesting way of setting up that theme too in this. And also I think that you think this is going to be a story of the political movement that he's joining, or the protest that he's joining, and then it just becomes him isolated from everything, right? It's like
yeah. No, it is fascinating. It's sort of, you know, once that scene is over, basically the individual is separated from the group, and we just follow this one individual's experience of trying to survive in his particular situation. It always seems very touching to me that you know, Umberto is living with this landlady, and one of the details that's in the script is that during the war, Umberto helped her with food, and he just feels so betrayed by her that she can't still provide him this room in his old age, in his loneliness, after the kind of help that he provided for her, you know, during the worst part of wartime. And it really hits me hard when he mentions that fact of what he had done for her, and the kind of callous way in which he's treating him, because now she's been lifted up for whatever reason, it's not explained, but she's not suffering from the war the way that the pensioners are. She's a landlady. She's making money, obviously, by renting. She's obviously joined the upper middle class by her parties and clothes, and so it almost feels like she can just leave that part of the war experience behind. And any reminder, like Umberto, is almost like she wants to
get rid of it,
throw it out, cast it away, which is really so sad, because
But it happens, and it's happening now.
Right.
I mean, the parallels to now are just extraordinary.
Mm-hmm.
And the facts of human nature, that once you have survived something and moved on, you really don't want to have something on your coattails, and
Right.
it's so beautifully drawn in this film.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Are there any other questions, Mara, that's come in?
There's a couple of comments, inspired by the parallels with today. So Celia Owen says, when you compare what was happening then with what is happening here now, I can say, having lived in Rome and near Sora for 10 years, beginning in 2006, and being daily with many friends who were children or teens during the war and after the war, the pain is still with them, and they tell stories of it every day.
Right.
And then Brian Deere also found the parallel between watching how the crowds of protesters are handled at the beginning of the film and how that is happening today, and also the scene where you see this vehicle kind of almost running into the crowd. I think we've seen many horrific moments like that in contemporary situations.
Our police are not that polite, however.
Yeah, right. Yeah, exactly. I also, in my research on the film, I discovered a wonderful, another interview with De Sica, where he talks about Umberto. And I was just wondering if I could read that for you, because this is really what the film means to him, and why he wanted to make it. He said, Umberto D is the creation I love the most. First of all, because it is dedicated to my father, but also because it was about the extremely profound and horrible drama of the post-war period, old age and solitude. It's a human film in that it addresses a subject, a drama as old as man himself, people's inability to communicate. The true drama is the lack of communication that exists, not only between the elderly man and his landlady, but also with the elderly man and his ward, the young girl of the house, the maid that lives with him, who helps him and is his friend. There's a lack of communication even between the two of them, where they just sort of talk over each other in many ways. I made no compromises. I didn't make a cent off this film, but today my Umberto D is in all the world's film libraries, and I am so proud to have made it. It's just so interesting to me that this idea of old age and loneliness and solitude was so much a part of what he was trying to convey in the film, and I think that's why the dog is so important in the film, because essentially you do learn early in the film that Umberto has no children. He doesn't have a wife, no relatives. He's basically alone. And I'm sure the relationship with the landlady was probably, in the past, a much closer one, but she's now pulling away from him. So really all he has in the world is Flake. And so as the film moves more and more into him as an individual, his relationship with the dog becomes so much more important in the course of the film. And the scenes with the dog are just, they're so touching, because it's really the only really close and unconditional love that Umberto gets is from that wonderful little dog. So it's just, it's just so interesting to watch him try to navigate through this situation. And so often, it's flight that keeps him connected in some way. I mean, there's actually two places in the film where flight prevents him from committing suicide. You know, it's when he's in the apartment and he realizes he's alone. He looks out the window and he has some suicidal thoughts. And you know, he almost, you can see that he's thinking about possibly leaping from the window. But then he glances down and he sees Flyke on the bed. And so it's Flyke who pulls him back away from the window, and he sits down with the dog and begins to pet it. And then obviously at the end of the film, which is really extraordinary to me, where you know, they go to the park together, and Umberto picks up Flyke and approaches the train tracks, and as the train is coming, is deciding whether he's going to commit suicide or not. And Flyke panics and runs away from him. He pulls himself away and runs away, and that draws Umberto back into the park, back to look after Flyke, to see where he's gone, and again that connection, that wanting to take care of him and wanting to find out where he is.
There is also there, and it's every one of these people is facing a sort of life and death struggle. The young woman,
Yes.
Her destiny is really not terrific at all.
No.
She says if the landlady finds out that she's pregnant, she will be on the street as well.
Yes.
So you go through the different degrees of people who are in a state of loss of everything. And that young woman, as you had pointed out, was not an actress. And the clarity and just the clean slate of her face,
Yes.
and what goes through her in a kind of innocent but detached way. She's not attached to herself. She's got this thing that's going to grow inside of her, and it's truly a look at the state of what young women went through at that particular, and still do, as a matter of fact. You know,
no, you're absolutely right.
I keep going back to this thing of, yes, that film was made then, but everything in that film has a resonance to life. We don't stop the cycle. We just keep continuing. Even
Right.
the lady is, you know, we can find her in several places at the moment. So
Yeah, definitely. I think it's interesting too that, you know, one of the, again, in terms of the writing of the film, it's interesting when Umberto discovers that Maria, the maid, has two army boyfriends. One is from Florence, and I think the other one's from Milan or whatever. And one is tall and one is short. And she's not even sure who the father is. But there's, again, in terms of that element of comedy, you know, that Mara was talking about, that is one of the comic things that comes about. We first see the two soldiers from a high angle view from Umberto's window, and you can see the difference in height. And it's almost a kind of comic shot in the way in which De Sica has done it, you know. And interestingly enough, it's like, I think the very last thing that he says to Maria as he's leaving the apartment, it's kind of an offhanded aside. He says, "Stay with the guy from Florence, get rid of the other one."
Right.
And then he goes out the door.
Go with the tall guy.
Which is interesting if you think that he was Napolitan, right? De Sica. I was trying to think if that was a sort of inside joke about him being from Naples.
Yeah, right. I know. Yeah. But it's definitely true. It's you know, and it's interesting too. There's a moment in the film that really strikes me when I see it is when there's a long scene where Maria goes into the kitchen just to prepare food for the landlady. There's no dialogue. She's the only person on screen. And it's just these little everyday actions that she does of putting the pot on the water, putting the kettle on the stove, but she feels her stomach. you know, and then she sits down at the table to do another task, and she sort of floats away. And you know she's thinking about the dilemma that she's in. But it's again, it's this unusual and very interesting moment that's all silent, very quiet. It's just kind of an interior moment where she's just trying to determine, what am I going to do? You know, what is going to happen to me? You know,
No answer.
Maybe we can look at that clip if,
Yep.
yeah, you want to?
sure. I think that the previous one didn't play very well, so maybe just let us know if it's not playing for the audience.
Sì, sì. Sì, noti pure. San Martino della Battaglia 14, terzo piano, presso Belloni.
Oh,
Grazie, grazie.
She's counting the days up there with the marker. This is not into a realistic shot.
That's a really amazing sequence, I think, honestly. I mean, just watching her, you just feel so much, I think, without very little going on, you know. And the detail of the cat walking on the roof is a wonderful detail that he put in there. And that great shot, the courtyard with the cat on the roof again. It's just, you can see the kind of poverty of the dwellings, and it's just so striking. It really is. And just to let the audience know too, Maria Pia Castillo, who plays Maria the Maid, she was a 15-year-old schoolgirl who attended an audition for the film just with some friends, and she had never even seen a film before in her life. She did not even know who De Sica was, even though he was a very famous actor and director at that point. She just went with her friends kind of to be with them. And De Sica spotted her in the balcony. He noticed her face, and he just was so struck by her face, this girl leaning over the edge of the balcony, he called her down. And he basically, just by her face and her movements and her being, decided there and then in that first audition in the theater that she was going to be the maid. Maria actually was totally reluctant. She didn't really want to do it at all. And she had a friend who had some experience in the theater, so she went and talked to her what she should do. She didn't really want to do the film, but De Sica wanted her. And the woman said to her, well, ask for 2 million lira and it'll be too much and they won't give it to you, and then you'll be free. You won't have to do it. And so she went to the office when they called her in, and she boldly asked for that amount of money, 2 million lira. And she was sure that they, you know, she kind of shocked them all and they were speechless, and she just left. But 3 days later, De Sica's production manager wound up at her home and with a contract for 2 million lira. But the thing is that, you know, once she started making the film with De Sica, she adored working with him. And De Sica really felt like he had found a real natural. She had no acting experience at all, 15 years old, but the camera adored her and she followed his direction to the T. A real kind of father-daughter thing developed between the two of them, that she was willing to do anything for him, and really completely and thoroughly enjoyed the experience of making the film and loved the film when it was done. She was so into the experience.
I think it's also a testimony to a time when all of these directors found a real essence or a real energy in a human being. And as the man escaped, when you think of that character that was cast and the character of Umberto as well, who was not an actor.
No.
And Mara, was it you that was saying that one of your students said that the two trained actors in the movie, the landlady and the dog, were not as compelling as the other people who were not professional actors in the film?
Yeah.
But there is a
that the landlady was very caricature.
Yeah, but they didn't have to adhere to someone saying, no, you have to cast Tom Hanks or Betty Davis or whoever it would have been. Certainly not Tom at that point, but there was no restriction on that. So they could really mold a performance in a way that, as you mentioned, the Asian writer, the director, the young Asian director, young woman. You mentioned her.
Chloe Zhao?
Yes. Chloe, she went through the Sundance program, and she brought her actor who was a kid from the res. And I watched her mold this performance for this young man. And it's reminiscent of what De Sica did with this young woman.
Yeah.
I mean, you can almost count the beats, but she is that face. I mean, you can't deny that, that just clear, lovely canvas.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
So we have a couple of questions. Should I bring them in now? Because I think they relate to this scene.
Yeah.
So Deborah Bolt asked earlier, that she's very struck by the sustained intimacy of the portrayal of Umberto de. Like she says that it's even radical. It feels radical even for today's standards, and she's wondering if it was noteworthy at the time. And then Marina La Palma says that the scene that we just showed reminds her of Jeanne Dillman, the Chantal Akerman film. And if we can talk about the tension between gender issues and age issues in the film, especially today in the light of the extreme devaluation of old people in the capitalist regime. And I think just to me, what's also really interesting and radical about, just thinking about Jeanne Dillman, because, Jeanne Dillman is famous for showing all these moments that are unworthy of the big screen, all these moments that are usually cut out, in narrative films, they're not dramatic enough to be action on screen. But, there's also the space, how the space is handled in the film. You see the space of the maid and you see the space of Umberto. You never see the landlady's space. Yeah. She sort of just disappears to the nothingness. So it's also, I think there's an interesting tension or maybe it's also radical in excising the space of the upper class or the upper, I mean, not that the landlady is necessarily upper class, but she sort of thinks she is, she thinks she's superior in that way. And there's something about the way the film prioritizes all these spaces and all these micro actions that, are not prioritized in the regular narrative hierarchy of films.
Right, exactly. Yeah. But it's fascinating because I think scenes like that do allow you as an audience to really imagine the interior space of the characters. Watching Maria just move around the kitchen in the way she does, all I'm doing is thinking about what she's thinking about, and what her situation is, and how hard it's going to be for her if she loses her job. How hard it's going to be for her if neither of those two soldiers will be honorable about her pregnancy. It really is a horrendous situation. And so as mundane as her actions are, it's like you begin to live and feel in her own interior space. And De Sica allows you the time and the space to be able to do that. And also by having cast this woman who just has, this young girl who just has this face that you can just read into, almost anything that you can imagine in a certain way. So it does have that amazing quality to it, which many filmmakers don't do. They don't allow the time for you to enter into the interior space of the characters. There's so much going on often, so much talk going on, so much action going on, whatever. You're not allowed the freedom and the time to live in there, which I think more filmmakers ought to do for sure. And I think that speaks to the intimacy that Deborah was speaking about. I think that's one reason why the film does feel so intimate, is because there's a lot of very silent, just visual scenes that you're just looking at their faces, both Umberto and Maria at various moments. And so you're just imagining, what they're thinking and what they're going through. And it just draws you in a very remarkably intimate way.
It's like reading a novel. I mean, you are allowed the time to fall into the character as if you we're falling into a beautiful book or a portrayal of character
Yeah.
in the book.
Right.
Should we discuss healthcare?
Well, I was actually going to bring up, because Joan, you mentioned this scene where the commendatore, where he runs into the commendatore, and and also this idea that Umberto doesn't change. He's like, he doesn't leave even if his room is being destroyed, like he doesn't leave. But there's that moment with the commendatore where you can't really completely decide if he just misunderstands Umberto and thinks like, oh, lucky you don't have to work, I still have to work, or he sort of distorts the situation to absolve himself of being knowing or intuiting that Umberto needs money, and he doesn't have time for him or something. Like, there's that mini moment where both men who have dedicated years of their lives to public service, and then one is just in a completely different situation.
I know that scene is devastating to me when he meets his two former colleagues, and can't quite bring himself to ask for their help, but he knows they know that he's looking for some help. And it's just the awkwardness of the whole thing, and Umberto wanting to keep his dignity and his pride, but at the same time being so desperate that he's right on the edge of letting that go. And the two men recognizing that, and again, not being willing to talk to him, not being willing to give. It's that lack of communication that Desika talked about as one of the themes that's in the film, not being able to give back. Even though you realize that this person you spend a lot of time with in the past is in such a desperate situation.
But also their own fear. I mean, they're holding on to their identity. Who knows if they're really in good shape or not? Everybody's putting on this, they have to hold on to their facade in a way. So it's there's so many layers of behavior in it that it keeps pulling your heart into the heart of this film in a way.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Well, Jason just appeared. Does that mean we have to wrap up? You want to kick us off?
Well, no, never. I want this to be one of those 24-hour channels.
Don't encourage us.
I could tune in at any hour to listen to you guys talk about cinema and life. The thing about this that I love about hearing you guys talk is that we start with the idea of a movie and we end up talking about all of these other things that are so deep. I mean, philosophy and politics and history and human nature, and it's really so rich and wonderful. And so I feel so grateful for you guys being here and being able to listen in on these moments and more deeply understand these films that I love, and I know I love them, but I'm understanding more why I love them. So that's really, it's amazing. And I think you're teaching us how to watch and how to listen, and that's really incredible. So giving us new eyes, so to speak. So I don't want to cut you off. We are at 71 minutes into our program, of course. So if we wanted to show, I don't know if we have a goodbye clip. I mean, we probably should have pulled the last happy clip for a goodbye clip, but we didn't do that. Although I probably could make it work if you give me a moment. But,
actually, I would suggest the clip where Umberto tries to beg. It again, it's one of my favorite scenes in the film, and that might be a nice way to go out on it, because I think it contains so much of the emotion of the film and an understanding of Umberto's character, that reluctance to beg, but the desperation to try. Why don't we leave the audience with that? Let them think about that.
I posted at the top of the chat the link. Please support the CCA and the Living Room series by making a year-end donation. Please support those in our community in need. I mean, this is an incredible portrait of a man in need, and he could have been helped by with so little, just a little bit of generosity, a little bit of a more compassionate society. Please do what you can to help us create that. And stay tuned for more information about our esteemed Council of Lost Classics. Their next presentation will be sometime late in January. Check out the website, the CCA website, or register for our e-blast to find out more. Thanks to Amara Nash for the engineering of this program. We do this all in our own living rooms, and there are brief moments where it feels like almost like a professional broadcast. And thanks again to Joan and Paul and Mara. I'm so grateful to be working with you. And let's watch what this is clip. I'm gonna have to figure out which clip it is.
Is it number 7? Is it
There
number
it is,
7?
clip 7. Here comes clip 7. We'll be ending the program after that. Thank you everyone for tuning in, and we'll see you next time in the living room.
All right, adios.
Sta fermo! Ma cosa fai lì? Commendatore, commendatore, come sta?
E guardavo qui il nostro flag, che cosa fa?
Gioca. Fa così tutto il giorno.
Quanto è bravo.